Today I'm going to show you how to make the Sam corset. It's a versatile and flattering piece with an exceptional fit. This is a great staple pattern that you can easily customize and build off of. Check out our socials for inspiration and to see how other designers are customizing their corsets. Before we begin, make sure that you have all of your fabrics and supplies. These are listed in the PDF instructions that come with your pattern. These are suggested pattern layouts based on your fabric width. More details about the cutting layout are in the PDF instructions download. While you're cutting your fabric, I recommend labeling your pattern pieces by writing the name of the pattern piece on a piece of tape and then taping that to the face side of the pattern piece. This will keep you from getting confused while sewing and will make the process much faster and easier. You can also label your pieces with a fabric type such as shell, underlining, or lining. The first step is to stitch the back body closure fabric to the back body closure interfacing at 3/8 of an inch. You can see that I'm moving the fabric around to sew from different directions. This is to make sure that I don't have any bubbles and that the interfacing and the fabric are lying flat on top of each other while I'm stitching. Once I've sewn it, I'm trimming about 1/4 inch off of the interfacing seam allowance. Then I'm going to repeat this on the other side. If you aren't using an underlining, you can skip ahead to the lining pre-stitching. You'll pre-stitch the shell pieces the same way that you pre-stitch the lining. Next, I'm pre-stitching the shell pieces to the corresponding underlining pieces at 3/8 of an inch. As I go, I'm making sure that I'm not getting any bubbles in the fabric, and I'm using a slightly longer stitch length than usual. I'm starting with the side body piece, but will be pre-stitching all of the pieces except for the back body closure panel. If the shell and underlining fabrics don't line up exactly, that's okay. You'll use the more stable fabric. For me, that's the underlining fabric as the guide. Once I'm done stitching, I can trim off any of my shell fabric that's past the edge of the underlining fabric. Here you can see I have some of the shell fabric that's going past the edge of the underlining fabric, but that's okay, I'll just trim that off later. Now we're moving on to the lining pieces, and I'm just pre-stitching the top and bottom edges at 3/8 of an inch. This is so that they don't stretch out while I'm handling them. Use a slightly larger stitch than you usually do, but make sure that your fabric stays flat. You don't want it bunching up. I'm doing this for all of the lining body pieces. On the side front body piece, I'm also stitching the bust curve. For the lining bust pieces, we're going to pre-stitch all of the sides. Next, we're stitching together the shell body. All of these pieces will be sewn face sides together and with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. We'll start by stitching the center front piece to the side front. The center front body piece has notches at the top and the bottom, so it's a little bit harder to tell which is the top and which is the bottom, but the top is slightly wider than the bottom. All of the other body pieces only have a notch on the top, so it's easier to tell which is the top end. I'm pinning these together and matching the notches and the top and the bottom, and then I'm going to sew them at the 3/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you back tack at the beginning and the end to secure the stitch line. Now I'm attaching the other side front to the center body. Now I'm grabbing the side body panel and I'm going to stitch that to the side front at 3/4 of an inch. Next, I'm taking the side back body piece and stitching that to the side body at 3/4 of an inch, always making sure that I'm matching the notches. Here I'm pinning the center back to the side back, and then I'm just going to sew those together at 3/4 of an inch. Now that I'm done with that side, I'm going to sew all of the shell body panels together on the other side. Here you can see that some of the shell fabric is hanging over the underlining fabric, so I'm just going to trim it before I keep sewing. Once you're finished sewing together all of the body panels on the other side, it should look like this. Next, I'm adding the center back closure panel and stitching it to the center back panel at 3/4 of an inch with the face sides together, and of course you want the inner facing to be facing the wrong side once it's finished. Now I'll stitch the back closure panel onto the other side. Now we're moving on to the lining body. These pieces are going to be sewn together the same way that we just did the shell, except for instead of having a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, they'll have a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. First, we're sewing the side front to the center front panel. Next, I'm going to sew the side panel to the side front panel. After that, we'll attach the side back panel. And finally, we'll attach the center back panel. Once you're done, you'll repeat on the other side, and when you're finished, it'll look like this. Now we're going to start on the bust cups. We're first going to do the shell bust, pin the side bust to the center bust, face sides together matching the notches, and then sew those together at 1/2 inch. Now we'll repeat that on the other side. Once you're finished, it should look like this. Now we're going to do the same thing for the lining bust pieces, again sewing together at 1/2 inch. The next thing we're going to do is clip along the curve of the bust seam allowances. We'll clip to 1/16 inch away from the stitch line, making sure not to clip through the stitching. Do that on both sides and then repeat it for the shell bust. Now we're going to press open the bust seams. I like to use a ham to do this. Press open the seams on the shell bust and the lining bust. Once you're finished, they'll look like this. The next step is pressing the body seams. For the lining, the seams will go towards the outside of the corset. For the shell, all of the seams except for the center back to center back closure seam will go towards the center. You can see in the photo the direction that you'll press all of the seams. Now we're going to start sewing the lining cups to the lining body. Start by matching the center of the bottom of the bust to the center of the center front body lining piece, face sides together. Then match the seams. Then pin the rest of the body to the bust, matching the notches. Then I'm going to sew these two together at 1/2 inch, making sure that I don't get any tucks while I'm sewing. I like to keep one hand between the two layers to make sure that the bottom layer of fabric stays flat. This is what it will look like when you're finished. And this is what it should look like from the inside. Next, we're moving on to the shell body, and we're going to be stitching down the seam allowances to make tunnels for the boning to go through. The seam allowances will be stitched down in the same direction that you pressed them down earlier. I sewed this first seam with the corset laying face side down, but I would recommend that you sew all of the seams with the face side up so that you can see how the fabric is laying. While I'm sewing, I lightly pull apart the sides of the fabric to keep it from bunching or pulling. We're going to sew down all of the seam allowances at 3/8 of an inch, except for the center back body to back body closure seam. That's the one that we press in the opposite direction, and we're not making a tunnel in that seam allowance. Getting the stitching an even distance from the seam and making sure that the fabric lies flat can take a few tries, so just be patient. Now that we've finished that side, we're going to do the same thing on the other side. When you're finished, your shell body should look like this. Now we're going to sew the shell body to the shell bust. We'll do this the same way that we did the lining, first matching up the center of the body and the bottom of the bust, and then the seam lines and then the notches. You'll sew them together at 1/2 inch. Once you're done sewing, make sure that there are no tucks in your fabric. It should look like this. Now we're moving on to the straps. I'm starting with the main strap. First, we're going to pin the center notches together, then pin a few more times. This ensures that your straps won't have drag lines. If you're using elastic for your straps, you can skip this step. I like to sew the straps with the fold to the inside of the sewing machine so that instead of measuring the seam allowance, I'm measuring the strap width. I want the fold of the strap to be at the 3/8 inch mark since my straps are going to be 3/8 of an inch wide. Next, I'm going to trim the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. You don't want the seam allowance to be too small because it could fray, but you also don't want it too wide because it could bulk up the strap. Now I'm grabbing my other main strap and just doing the same exact thing. Now I'm taking the small back straps and just sewing them the same exact way that I did with the other straps, making them 3/8 of an inch wide. Then I'll cut down the seam allowances to 1/4 of an inch. Now, as you can see, I've already turned out one of my small straps, but I'm just going to use my turner tool to do the other one. Now I'm moving on to the main straps. As you'll see, I'm struggling a little bit. I highly recommend you use a quick turn tool. I think they're much easier to work with for thin straps than this tool I'm using. Here I'm trimming off the ends that got frayed and damaged while I was turning out the straps, making sure that I trim the same amount from each one so that the lengths stay even. Next, you'll press all of your straps flat so that the seams are at the side or the back of the strap and are not visible from the face side. Now I'm putting the strap rings on my small back straps and then folding the strap in half and stitching it together at around 3/8 of an inch. The face side of the strap is going to be the side that's facing outward, so make sure that the seam isn't visible from that side. Repeat for the other back strap. This step and the next steps for the straps are the same whether you're using elastic or fabric for your straps. Now I'm stitching the straps to the shell body. The long main straps match up to the notch on the top of the side bust pieces. Here I'm going to stitch it at about 3/8 of an inch, face sides together, back tacking a couple of times to make sure that it stays in place. Here you want to make sure that the strap seam will not be visible from the front side, which is the side that's currently facing down. Now we're going to attach the back straps to the notch at the top of the shell side back panel. It's very close to the seam connecting it to the center back panel, and we'll stitch that down at about 3/8 of an inch. In the photo you can see exactly where the back straps are stitched down. Next we're working on the shell back closure. We're going to first fold it down at the center notch, face side to face side. I'm pinning that down, and then I'm going to flip over the seam allowance 5/8 of an inch and pin that down as well. I'm going to stitch that down at 3/8 of an inch on the top and then do the same for the bottom. And once you're done, you'll repeat it on the other side. Now we're pinning the shell to the lining so that we can connect them at the top edge. I'm going to start by pinning the center of the lining bust to the center of the shell bust, face sides together. Next, I'm matching up the bust seams and then going down and matching up all of the other seams and notches, making sure that the straps stay between the shell and the lining. The lining won't extend to the very end of the shell fabric, but that's how it's supposed to be. Just make sure that the notches on the center back panel on the shell and the lining are matched up. Now I'm just pinning everything together on the other side. Next, starting at one of the ends, I'm going to sew the shell and the lining together where I just pinned them with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're turning the pieces right side out and understitching on the lining side. We're going to sweep the seam allowances to the lining side and stitch about 1/16 of an inch away from the stitch line you just made. This helps to keep the lining from showing on the face side of the garment when it's worn. Here you can see I have all of the seam allowances going towards the lining. So I'll just stitch through the lining and the lining and shell seam allowances. I have the seam that I just sewed right to the inside of the left prong of my sewing foot, so my stitch line is about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam. I'm pulling the fabric apart slightly while I sew to keep the fabric from bunching or dragging. Once you're finished, it should look like this. The next step is to cut the boning. I'm going to start with the center front panel boning. In the video, you only see me measuring one side, but you should measure both sides and use the shorter measurement to calculate the boning length. When I measure, I'm measuring from the top seam to the very bottom of the hem. The length of the boning is going to be the length of the seam minus 7/8 of an inch. 1/2 inch is taken away for the seam allowance, and the other 3/8 of an inch is so that you have enough space between the boning and the hem to sew. For example, my measurement was 7 5/8 of an inch, so I'm cutting the boning to 6 3/4 of an inch. I definitely recommend keeping all of your boning pieces organized after you cut them so that you don't forget where each piece goes. Now I'm attaching a cap to the boning that I just cut using 2 sets of pliers, one to squeeze the cap from the top and the bottom, and the other to squeeze the sides of the cap. Make sure that the cap is secure and you can't pull it off. This piece of boning already had a cap on one end, that's why I'm just applying one cap to the other end. If your boning doesn't have caps, you'll have to apply one to each end. Now I'm cutting the boning for the other side using the first bone that I cut as a guide since they're going to be the same length. Here I'm just making sure that the lengths match up. Now I'm attaching the cap, again using the pliers to squeeze the sides and the top and the bottom. Now I'm moving on to the side front seam, measuring both sides and choosing the shortest measurement. Then I'm subtracting 7/8 of an inch from that measurement and cutting the boning to that length. I cut another bone off camera that was the same length for the other side front seam. At this point, I have 4 pieces of boning that I've cut and capped. Now I'm doing the same thing for the side seams. Once I'm done, I'll have 6 metal bones in total. Now we're moving on to the Ridgeline boning. The process is going to be the exact same as it was for the metal boning, except for instead of capping the ends, I'm going to melt them. You can also choose to file them. I'm going to first measure my side back seams, choose the shortest length, and then subtract 7/8 of an inch. Then I'll cut the boning to that length. Here I'm cutting 2 pieces of boning, 1 for each side. I'm also trimming the edges of the boning to make them a little rounder, but that's not necessary. Now I'm melting the edges, making sure that they're smooth. Now I'm starting on the center back body to back body closure seam, doing the same thing, taking the measurement, subtracting 7/8 of an inch, and then cutting the boning. I didn't record this part, but you're doing the same thing for the center back closure seam that you can see I'm measuring here. Once you're finished, you should have 12 pieces of boning in total. Now I'm going to insert the boning pieces into their correct tunnels. First, insert them into the center front, making sure to push them all the way to the top edge. Then do the side front, side, and side back tunnels. You'll have 4 pieces of Ridgeline boning left over that we're not putting in until later. Next, we're going to sew together the shell and the lining bottom edges. The lining is shorter than the shell, so you'll have to pull it up a bit to get it to match up to the shell. I'm starting the pinning from the center front and then matching all of the seams until I get to the end. Now I'm pinning the other side. Again, the lining won't reach the very edge of the shell at the center back closure, and that's how it's supposed to be. Now I'm going to sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure that the boning is pushed all the way up to the top edge so that it doesn't get in the way of the sewing machine. And of course, make sure that you back tack at the beginning and the end. Next, you're going to pull the corset right side out through one of the openings on the side. Here I'm just straightening out the corset a bit before I go to press it. Now I'm pressing the corset, making sure that the lining is to the inside and isn't visible at all from the right side. Next, I'm flipping out the back body closure edges by holding the seam allowance down on the corner while I turn it out so that I get a sharp corner. We're going to fold in the back body closure seam allowance about 1/2 inch and press it down flat. Here I'm just pressing down the top edge of the corset, again making sure that the lining won't be visible from the right side. Now I'm turning out the back body closure panel on the other side the same way that I did it on the first side. And finally, I'm just giving the corset a good press from the right side. Now we are going to put in the back closure boning. We'll start by taking one piece of the Ridgeline boning and shoving it all the way to the back edge. Now you're going to stitch right next to the edge of the boning, so 5/16 inch away from the fold of the back body closure piece. Now I'm going to stitch another line 1/2 inch away from the last row of stitching. Now I'm putting a piece of Ridgeline boning in the pocket. Then I'm going to mark with my heat sensitive pen. You can use chalk or a heat sensitive marker, or pins also work. And I'm doing this halfway between the line of stitching that I just made and the seam connecting the back body closure to the back body. I didn't get the whole thing on video, but you can see I marked all the way down. Now I'm stitching through where I just marked, keeping the boning pushed up against the previous stitch line. You're going to be stitching through the Ridgeline boning. Now we're moving on and finishing the straps. First, you're going to weave your strap through the strap adjuster. I didn't get this on video, but it's very straightforward. Make sure that you keep the strap straight, then put it through the back strap ring. After that, you're going to take it up and around and weave it back under the strap adjuster center prong. This can be a bit difficult and you may have to clip off the very end of the strap to get it through. Now we're going to fold over about 1/4 of an inch of the edge of the strap towards the back of the strap. Stitch this down using a small stitch length. Here I'm pulling out more of the strap so that I have more room to sew. Now we're going to stitch it down to the inside of the strap. Your strap should look like this when you're finished. Now repeat on the other side and make sure that the straps will be an equal length once you're done. Now we're moving on to the grommets. Measure the length of the back closure panel between the boning. You are going to take this measurement, for me it was 7 inches, and put this number aside. Then I'm going to mark 1/2 inch down from the top and 1/2 inch up from the bottom. This will be the placement for my first and last grommet. Next, take the measurement that you took in the last step. Mine was 7 inches. Subtract 1 and then divide that by 5. For me, that number was 1.2, which is about 1 3/16 of an inch. Mark that distance down from your top mark, then make 3 more marks 1 3/16 of an inch apart. Once you're done with the first side, you'll do the same thing on the other side. Once you're finished, both of your side back closure panels should look even. Now we're punching holes where the marks you just made are. I highly recommend using a punch that's made for the size of grommet that you're using. I used one that was too small. Because my hole was so small, I had to use scissors so that the grommet would fit in. Place the grommet so that the larger piece is on the top and the washer is on the bottom. Repeat for the rest of the grommets and insert them on the other side. Once you're finished, your back body panels should look like this. Now all we have to do is lace up the corset. I like to lace mine simply, starting from the top and lacing it to the bottom.